Hey everyone, today I'm lucky to have Yalda here with me, and we're going to hear her story of overcoming many, many years of fibromyalgia and pelvic pain and other symptoms. It was a very difficult, long road for her, but she has recovered from mind-body root cause-oriented approaches, and we'll all be able to learn so much from you. And we're so grateful that you're even sharing your story. Many are afraid to, honestly. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
Tell me about what it was like, even from the beginning when these things started in your life, and we could just go from there.
Yeah. I mean, my earliest memories as a child includes being in agony. So it started with like pelvic pain and urinary symptoms at the age of 5. So, like the chronic frequency and urgency and, tensions in the pelvic area. And obviously, my parents were like taking me to the doctors, right? Taking me to the pediatrician. And every time it was like, oh, she must have a urinary tract infection. And so, this is enraging, but I was being treated for UTIs, even though I never had one. I was being put on antibiotics. I was being put on medications because doctors would say, well, sometimes, UTIs don't show up on the urine test or the blood test, but you have the symptoms. So we're going to treat it as if you have one. And so that's kind of like how things started for me, was just being medicated. And of course, the medications didn't work because I didn't have anything, seriously medically wrong. There were no structural issues. I was like the poster child for mind body syndrome. And, the pelvic pain is interesting because it kind of, as I got older, the pain would be my brain would like put it on the back burner and I would start developing other chronic pain issues. So from like 5 to 11, I had the pelvic pain, the urinary issues. And then around 11, I started developing chronic headaches and chronic stomach aches. And so when that happened, the pelvic pain, was more like mild. And again, just going throughout the course of my life, I started developing other pain issues in different parts of my body. And anytime that happened, again, the pelvic pain was like put on the back burner. But then eventually the pelvic pain and the urinary symptoms, they would come back. They would take center stage again at various points in my life, and they'd be like the leading actress. And each time the pelvic pain came back, it came back with a greater intensity and worse symptoms, worsening symptoms.
Yeah, so that continued on even like you had different forms of it, different shades of it at different ages, all into what age even? Like how long were you going through all these things?
So it was a total of 28 years. It started at 5, and then by 20, I developed fibromyalgia. And so I wasn't diagnosed until I was 22 because for 2 years they were just running a bunch of tests. Because the doctors really didn't want to give me that diagnosis because they're basically saying, we don't know what's wrong with you, you know? And so we can identify a serious issue here. And but even with the fibromyalgia, like on top of fibromyalgia, which is, characterized by widespread pain, I had like chronic lower back pain, for 6 years. And I had chronic neck pain, for like 7 years. And so I was still developing pain, like in, different parts of my body on top of the fibromyalgia. And it would just, move around in the classic mind body syndrome fashion. Sometimes it would be the pelvic pain, and that would just take up all of my focus, and then other days or for months or years, it would be, yeah, pain in a different part of the body. So it was like overwhelming, honestly, like having like, on top of the pain, also dealing with like cognitive challenges, right? Like mental fatigue, that's like when your brain feels like cottage cheese and your mental faculties feel crossed and haywired and you can't even focus. And, or the physical fatigue, right? That like excruciating tiredness feeling in your body, you feel it in your bones. And sometimes the fatigue would be worse than the pain. So there were like other issues on top of like physical pain as well that I was struggling with. So I could irritable bowel syndrome, there'd be like sometimes 10 symptoms that I was dealing with. And so, it was just really challenging to deal with all of that on a daily basis.
And for how much of this period of time did you think there was something structurally wrong with your body, like a disease or something that was diagnosed, like you said, by doctors? Was that going on until like the very end, the last couple of years, you realized there was a mind body connection? Or, yeah, tell me about that. Like, where were you at mentally on this? It's like, well, I was just stricken with these diseases early in my life for some reason. Other people around me are healthy. What the hell? Why did this happen to me?
Yeah. I mean, when I started developing fibromyalgia at 20, that's when I was a little nervous. Up until then, I was fine, I think. But, I remember thinking something was wrong because I was actually in the most remarkable physical shape. I had been kickboxing for 3 years. I had been weight training. My body was like literally solid muscle. And I remember like being in the gym, not being able to do push-ups. And my trainer's like, Mohammadi, get it together. And I'm like, I don't know why my body feels so weak. Maybe I'm like about to start my period. Like I didn't understand it because that was so unusual for me because I didn't just have like average strength. I was above average actually in terms of my physical strength. And again, this is a mind body syndrome, right? Root issue fibromyalgia is not in the body. So it's like, how did I like have this strong physique? I went from weight training to not even being able to lift a 2-pound weight. I had to quit the gym completely. So from 20 to 22, that's when I started just freaking out. Cause I'm like, if I am in this great of shape, then there's something serious going on and the doctors just haven't figured it out yet. And I think the reason why I felt that was because with fibromyalgia at the time, at least, I was told, we don't know what causes fibromyalgia. There's no cure, and it gets worse with age. The worst things you could tell somebody, right? And so I was like in a state of panic. And I think I had been in a fight or flight state since childhood. But once I got into my 20s, like my fear and my anxiety, my depression was just growing. And so that was also, of course, exacerbating the body, right? Because the mind affects the body. And so I really got gradually worse each year from like 20 to like early 30s, right around the time when I started to recover.
Could you paint the picture of one of the harder days that you experienced? Or let's say when your symptoms were at their worst, what was a day like for you?
Oh my God, not being able to move, period. Yeah. Like when I would have a fibromyalgia flare up, basically my body would feel frozen because it was like fight, flight, or freeze. And I froze. And so even if I tried to do this, like move my neck like this, lift my arm up, I mean, these are things that I physically could not do. And I remember going through a really bad flare up that lasted for about 4 weeks, where I just had very little ability to move at all. And I was basically just bedridden, couldn't go home for the holiday. I remember my dad calling me and being like, I will come and pick you up. Like, I'll drive down there. And I'm like, no, I cannot move my body. Like, you don't understand. So, really hard, really isolating. And living on my own obviously makes it a little bit harder because I didn't have anyone to really help me, care for me. So yeah, I think that for me, it was the worst when I couldn't move. If I dared to move, I would be in just absolute agony. And the flare up pain is a little bit different than like the day-to-day chronic pain because the flare up pain just feels like it actually, for me, it felt like my bones were broken. And so when I read Unlearn Your Pain, and there was a fact about fibromyalgia that brain imaging studies reveal that the pain from fibromyalgia can be felt as deeply as a bone fracture. That resonated with me. I was like, oh my God, that's literally how I felt. So it's like a very, very deep pain. And it's scary to be in that kind of pain and to be on like 5 muscle relaxers, steroids, painkillers, and for them to almost barely take the edge off. Again, that's makes you even more scared because you're like, God, I can't even like rely on medications. Like, and I was very, very against taking medications. I'm just one of those people, like, I don't want to take medications unless I'm in so much pain. But even when I was in so much pain, I got very little relief. I'm like, I had a very strong mind.
Yeah. And if I can jump in really quick, just all that's incredibly challenging to hear and to experience. But I also wanted to say, anyone who's listening who might be like, well, she's talking about fibromyalgia right now, but I have pelvic pain and my perineum hurts, I'm having trouble with sex, etc. We're going to be tying it all together. It's actually all interrelated. The same root causes can create symptoms throughout your whole body or your pelvic floor or headaches or back pain, etc. And in case someone's quite new to this concept of neuroplastic pain or neuroplastic symptoms, your brain and nervous system has the ability to create all sensations in the body and can and will create pain and dysfunction as a messenger that something needs to be listened to, let go of, that there are stressors that are beneath the surface that are not natural to be in your mind body system any longer. You've been carrying them around for maybe a very long time. Maybe you've been carrying them around since you were a kid, even, or, whatever this happened. Sometimes people also have like an injury or something happens. I've had people say like, oh, I was having sex, or like I was using a sex toy and I'm afraid I messed myself up for life. And again, injuries do heal. So you might have an acute injury, but you could then learn that pain in terms of the neural circuit. So we'll definitely be connecting it all together, and just so that people realize it's the same thing ultimately. And that's why it's medically unexplained. Like we don't really understand how this is happening, because they're kind of looking in the wrong area, perhaps they're just looking at the body. They're just looking at the anatomy and the biology, not considering thoughts and emotions. I did want to ask though about the pelvic and urinary side, because I know you had it at different times.
Yeah.
How did it affect your life, let's say as an adult? Did it affect you? Maybe you had urinary frequency and you're afraid to go out because you thought you would have to pee. Did it make sex challenging at times? Or I'm just curious, anything like that with
Yeah.
those symptoms?
Well, so my pelvic pain came back with a vengeance when I was 16. And I was training to be a dancer. That was like my dream. I had a background in the performing arts. And this was a really, really challenging time for me because my pelvic pain came back and I physically was in so much pain in the pelvic area that I couldn't do like my leaps. Or if I did the splits, it was painful. And as a dancer, that's like the worst thing that can happen to you. You're no longer able to execute, your strength and to do the technique, which was very rigorous, like when you're training to be a professional dancer. And so I remember just thinking, what's going on with my body? And thought, well, I guess I just pushed myself so hard over these years that my body is basically breaking down on me. I'm like 16 in my prime. Like, I don't know why I was thinking that. I ended up quitting the dance team, which was such a heavy decision for me. That was like the one thing that I had that brought me a lot of joy and happiness. I had to let go of it. I let the other dancers down. They were so pissed at me. And here's the thing is that I didn't even tell them what I was going through because I didn't understand it fully. So there was like little to no compassion for me at that time because, I wasn't being communicative, but I was also just really struggling. So that almost made it worse because, I had some friends who were just like, well, we're not going to talk to you. So the pain got really bad. And then it kind of like became mild again at some point. It was there, but as long as I didn't do rigorous things like the splits or any kind of like physical, you know, anything that would exacerbate that area, I was fine. But that was a really big deal, right? That I kind of put the dancing on hold. And I eventually returned to it for a little bit. And I started doing dancing that didn't require that kind of flexibility and rigor. And I was okay. But when it eventually came back again several years after that, and what I mean is that the pelvic pain took center stage again. I remember having, the frequency, the urgency, which was terrible, feeling like I had to go to the bathroom like every 10 minutes and being in so much pain, not being able to, leave the house. Or if I did, I felt like the urgency and the frequency would just intensify like times 1,000. And so it was miserable to go anywhere, to be in traffic. So I felt like my life would become really small, like especially when I had the pelvic pain, especially. because I felt like I had to be glued to a nearby restroom at all times. And then there was just a lot of embarrassment to being in public. Like, why does she keep going to the bathroom? Like you just went. So naturally, I didn't really want to be around people because of that as well.
Totally. I'm curious about kind of looking into, we'll talk about even how you got better and some of the big needle movers and takeaways, but identifying root causes, and I use the word root cause, and all I mean by that for anyone who's listening, the things that are actually the first domino that tipped over, the first domino that tipped over that led the brain or the nervous system to be on high alert and to perceive things as threats, even though they could be dealt with conversation or with a caretaker. It's talking about like a child, for example, having someone intervene and realize there's a connection here with stress and the environment and emotions and family, and someone having the awareness and ability to care for that child with love and not put them in a great deal of fear that their body is broken or something like that. So, but not even just the whole situation. I'm curious, like, why do you think this happened, or what was going on inside of your mind body system that led to these symptoms?
Yeah, such a great question. And I've spent a lot of time, as you can imagine, psychoanalyzing my entire life and to think about, well, what was happening at the age of 5? That's such a young age to develop chronic pain, but as long as you can generate emotion, you can experience chronic pain, right? And so for me, my parents, were immigrants from Iran. They had escaped political persecution. And I just remember them being in survivor mode my entire childhood, just learning a new culture and learning a new language, getting up on their feet. So my environment, pretty much most of the time from like 5 to 20, was chaotic, was unpredictable. And so I think that I really felt that, because a parent's stress can program a child's physiology. And you can't separate the child from the environment. And being sensitive, I think I was born a little sensitive, and some people are. You can be born sensitive. I think on top of that sensitivity, I was just internalizing so much of the stress around me. And my nervous system just went into fight or flight stage at a very young age. So I think having that dysregulated nervous system and, staying in a fight or flight stage for most of my life is what really exacerbated those pain symptoms. I remember just having an absolute inability to relax as a child. My mom would take me to the movies and I would be like, I couldn't sit still, and I'd be like standing on the seat, moving around. And you would think, oh, maybe she had ADHD, but no, my nervous system was just so revved up. And, that took a toll. I will also say that, my feelings, I think, were neglected as a child as well. I think being a sensitive child and having so much emotional depth from a very young age. And, my parents are baby boomers, and no offense to the older generation, but I feel like my parents, and I think a lot of parents, just didn't have a lot of emotional skills. And so I grew up in a very authoritarian household where, you know, the standard of perfection was really high, right? Like I was expected to be the best at everything I did. If you made mistakes, it was just unacceptable. So I grew up in a yelling household. And I think that was challenging in the context of emotions because I didn't have the opportunity to ever really express my feelings, right? So if I got in trouble, it's like that classic example of like the father yelling at their child saying, go to your room. And you're like, and you want to like say something like, but I accidentally broke the vase, or, you just want an opportunity to say something and you get shut down. But nothing, go to your room. You go to your room, you sleep, and then the next day it's like everything's fine. So I think I learned how to just bottle everything in as a child, which I think was the worst thing that I learned from my childhood. Because guess what? When I got older and I was dealing with real life stressors like conflict, like betrayal, I never confronted it. I just literally imploded. I internalized those feelings of anger, of resentment, and it affected my health. And so I think I'm all for discipline. Trust me, I don't have children, but I already know when I do that I'm going to be I'm going to discipline my children. But I think that there's a way to discipline children, right? While also giving them that opportunity, right? To communicate and really just to build that emotional connection with your child. So a part of my healing, I know we'll get to this, has been around just really learning how to articulate my feelings, because that was something that I never did. You know, I essentially wasn't really allowed to have feelings, to really feel my feelings. And so I think that that played a really big role with my chronic pain challenges.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of how, you could have developed that as a child, I think looking at the chakra system or even the energy centers model is useful to realize it's not random what part of the body that a particular condition shows up in. And in the root of the body, we have the pelvic floor close to the bladder as well. And this particular part of the body gets impressions of survival, sexuality, or fear that can put it in or out of balance quite easily. And it sounds like you were in a position where survival was very out of balance, even though you might have had a roof over your head and food to eat. But there is a general sense that we've got to strive and work really hard to make sure we're okay for tomorrow. And that sounds like that was possibly something that was going on.
That was it. And one important aspect that I want to mention too is around secondary trauma that I had when I was 5. My mom was in a fire in our home. And my brothers and I, we were playing basketball outside. So, fortunately for us, we were okay. But this was really scary for me because I have, those memories of my mom like screaming my brother's name because she was literally on fire and us running into the home. And, she survived, fortunately. But I was so horrified as a child to see my mom like covered in blood, being burnt. And I think that I learned fear from such a young age, to learn, oh my God, my mom, my hero, you know, could have died. Like I was experiencing like really heavy emotions from a young age. So even though it wasn't like, you know, major trauma to me specifically, it was still, witnessing something so traumatic that happened to my mom. And I think that can be very scary for a child. And again, that wasn't dealt with, right? We didn't do therapy. We didn't, it was like, and my mom is so stoic. Like she was so strong through that. We just didn't talk about it. And I think I was a child that needed to talk about it. Like, wow, I almost lost my mom. And yet we're sweeping this underneath the rug and we're just going on like nothing has happened. But I'm left with these memories that even today, like I can still remember the sound of her scream. I still remember her body being in her bed and it was almost like she was dead. Like I would go in there and I would touch her because she was in so much pain. Being burnt is like probably one of the worst pains. So I had to work through some of that trauma as well. But I think that, yeah, I think that that certainly in terms of like the fear, which, fear is what perpetuates so much of our pain. I think that I learned fear at a young age. And honestly, there were more traumatic things that happened to family members, after that as well, that just continued to just trigger me over and over and over again.
Yeah. Just like as an experiment, if you were the mind body coach who was hired by your parents when you were 5, what would you have done to help little Yalda to not have a chronic condition at that moment in time?
Yeah. I mean, I think I would really encourage a conversation between the parents and the child because I would say that I needed an opportunity to share like what I'm sharing right now and talking about how scared I was going to lose my mom. I have these horrible memories or I saw my mom, you know, in such a and she was covered in blood. Like I would want to be able to say all of those things. And so I think just having that open line of communication and also, having my feelings validated, right, from my parents would have been really important.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious about so you talked about when you were a child and some of those impressions. What about later on in your life? Was it kind of interrelated, this inability to experience and express your emotions and see them as important? Or what else would you say
Well,
was part of the root cause stew here?
you know what? I actually feel like I'm very emotional and I feel things very strongly. Like I do. And it's actually, I think, a really beautiful thing most of the time when I'm feeling good things. But I think for me, yeah, it was very difficult, even if I felt something, to articulate it because I learned people pleasing really, really early in life. And people, which a lot of people with chronic pain struggle with people pleasing, there's this fear, one, of confrontation, and there's a fear of rejection. And so I feel like I dealt with that in so many relationships where I would just be like seething on the inside because somebody had hurt me or because somebody was being disrespectful. I was just wasn't happy, right? I was, you know, going through a hard time in a particular relationship. And it could have been like a personal relationship, or it could have been like a collegial relationship as well. And I just felt like I felt trapped. I felt like there's nothing that can be done. Like, because guess what? I learned in childhood, my feelings don't matter. So what's the point in saying anything? I'm just going to get shut down, right? Or it's going to turn to conflict. And I had this fear, right? Of I was surrounded by so much conflict that I became so conflict avoidant. But the reality was that that did not help me at all, right? Because guess what? Things eventually got worse because I wasn't having those direct conversations. And then eventually I would just like burst and I would like go off. And then I would get really angry. So then the others would be like, oh my God, like, you're such a bitch. You're such a this. You're so crazy. All these things that women get called, right? When they show anger. And it's like, actually, I'm responding to years of being abused by you, you know? So I really had to learn in order to avoid that. I have to be more authentic in my relationships, and I have to find the way, I have to find the courage to learn how to articulate what I'm feeling and really what my needs are, because we all have needs, wants, and desires when it comes to all of our relationships. And that's something that I need, and maybe me specifically, I need to ensure that I'm expressing this. And so that played a really big role into my recovery, was I had the feelings and I was aware of them, but it was connecting with other people and actually building more of an emotional connection, which I think was one of the struggles that I had with my romantic partners, with men. It was like having a mental connection is great, having a sexual connection is great, but there was always this lack, an emotional connection where, my emotional needs weren't being met. And that's something that because of that, it was like failed relationship after failed relationship and me feeling horrible about myself. But in doing the work in coaching and gaining more self-awareness, that's when I realized that my emotional needs weren't being satisfied. And that's something that I personally need. So I just think it comes down to really knowing yourself. Like, in order to heal yourself, you have to know yourself, the good parts and the parts that need a little bit of work.
Yeah. I definitely know that some people are listening who are kind of where you were at, feeling stifled, and they want to be able to speak their truth. They want to not people please, but they just feel like there's tape over their mouth or something, like their
Yeah.
hands are just handcuffed. How did you really change? Let's say whether it was in a romantic relationship or with a family member, maybe you might choose one relationship in your mind. It's like, oh yeah, before there was like this antagonizer and I just let it all happen. And then I started to change. Do you remember like how you actually did it though?
Well, for me, it was the easiest to draw boundaries with family members. Because I think sometimes it's easier to draw boundaries with people who you feel like, they won't like dump you. Like with my family, we're just so ride or die. I could just say whatever and they would still come and pick me up at the airport, right? Like I know that I'm not going to sever that tie. But when it came to like, for me, it was the hardest with work, with colleagues, because I was like, I could get fired. I could get fired if I, am open and honest about what my boundaries are, or, having to say no, that I have too much on my plate. Or with boyfriends, I felt like that was probably the hardest for me, because it was like, oh, well, if I express my need, then I'll get dumped. And so I found that it was the hardest for me with my work relationships and my romantic relationships.
And so it's a
Um,
fear of the loss around the things that really matter to you. You're like, I really love this job and I really want to be in a relationship. I don't want those things to end. So you kind of appease the situation so it stays around.
exactly. And I think honestly for me, it was like once I read Sarno's books, listen, I would have never thought of myself as a people pleaser. Like, excuse me? And it wasn't until I read his books where I was like, oh my God, like he is speaking to my soul. Like, this is me. And I was really inspired, like probably the most inspired I've ever felt after reading his books. And so once I made that connection that people pleasing is costing my health, that people pleasing is contributing to, if not one of the main reasons why I have fibromyalgia, oh, that put me into action real quick. I needed to intellectually understand that, right? I needed someone to make that connection for me. And it made sense, right? It wasn't like it makes absolute sense, right? When you are constantly putting yourself last, I think as women too, throughout history, we have been acculturated to self-sacrifice, right? To put other people's needs first, to caretake. And once I realized that, yeah, that's me, like my needs, wants, and desires aren't being met, I started taking action steps. So one, I needed that inspiration to kind of light a fire underneath me. And I needed that intellectual understanding. And then I worked with a coach. I worked with a coach, actually a life coach, who helped me navigating some difficult conversations. And you know what? I will say that I started doing this with my colleagues, and it went really well, because here's the thing is that we have, with people pleasing personality types, there's such a fear of conflict, but there's actually a way to address conflict in a really healthy way. It's not like, oh my God, I'm coming at you with a knife. It's like you can facilitate a really smooth conversation. So I learned how to be this smooth communicator where I was articulating how I felt, but I was doing it diplomatically. So then my colleagues were like, oh, yeah, okay. I was like, oh, I made that so big in my head for years that I couldn't have this conversation, and it went well. Now, I understand sometimes you have the conversation and it doesn't go well, but that was a risk I was willing to take, because again, my health was on the line. So I was willing to take that risk. And I think for me, it was like learning honestly self-love, which I think is the gateway to my healing, learning how to really love myself. I wanted what was best for me. And so I said, you know what? As long as I trust myself, and as long as I approach these really challenging conversations with the best intentions, I'm working with a coach, I'm being so thoughtful and so intentional in how I'm articulating myself. If it doesn't go well, that's not my fault, because I'm doing my best. So I kind of learned how to trust myself. And so again, it actually went well. And you know what? My colleagues actually respected because of it, because I was actually being authentic. I was showing up as Yalda, and people were seeing who I really was, not who I was pretending to be. And then, eventually I started building up the courage to do the same thing in my relationships with men, being more honest and being more vulnerable. Because what I learned was what I've been doing up until this point hasn't been working out for me, right? And at some point, you have to stop blaming the other gender. Like, I can't be like, oh, men are assholes or one sexist jerk. It's like, it's so easy to do that, right? At some point, you have to look at your own role in your heartbreak. And so if you want a new outcome, you need a new approach. So I started to change the way that I approach dates. And yeah, I really just started I just started showing up as myself. Like I had it in me all along to be a communicator. I've always been a strong communicator. It was that I chose not to do it out of fear. And, sometimes that led to maybe a connection not working out. But I was like, well, I'm glad it didn't work out now. versus later, because guess what? This is who I really am. And I want somebody who wants to be with who I really am, not with who I'm pretending to be. So when you're being people pleasing, like I said, you're not really being true to yourself. You're not showing up in an authentic way. And so as a result, you may attract the wrong people as well, which I did for many years.
It's amazing that you found that link with Sarno's books and the information. That's why we're putting this interview on the internet so that people can see that there's a link here. Because before, the link could have been, wow, like I got to stop dancing because I'm hurting my pelvic floor when I do this. Or when I go lift weights, must be making it worse, or what I'm eating, etc. People are using a magnifying glass to look at everything outside of them. Like, what's out there that's causing my issue? But turn it around and see that it's a mirror. Look at yourself. It's like, oh, what's in here that's causing my issue? And that's what's cool. Some people don't even know there's a link though. They just have no idea. I'm like, wow, I can see personality tendencies that are based in fear or really survival-oriented tendencies that were created earlier on in life to be able to get by can be
Yeah,
discarded because you're safe now.
exactly. Exactly. And that's how I understood the people pleasing. It was a survival tactic that I learned in childhood that I took with me into my adulthood, but I didn't need it. I didn't need it in adulthood.
Yeah. So about the recovery, that was clearly a big part of it for you. What else was going on? What else started to change to let go of all these symptoms?
Yeah. So for me, and again, this is going to sound unusual, but it was working on my life purpose. I think that I've always felt this sort of hunger and drive to make a difference in society, as corny as that sounds. And I was actually doing it in some ways, but I didn't feel entirely fulfilled. So I felt depressed. I felt, oh my God, I'm 30 years old and I haven't it's that timeline, that pressure that we feel like I'm unmarried, I don't have kids, I'm still figuring out exactly what I want to do. And so I had this lack of purpose. Again, even though I had like a great job, I just think that I wanted so much more out of life. And I felt like I wasn't utilizing my full skill set. I wasn't, for me being very passionate, I want my work to align with my passion as well. So for many years feeling very lost and confused. And I think as a result, that affected my self-esteem. Like I didn't feel really good about myself. I didn't feel really confident about the direction I was headed in. And so when I started doing coaching and when I started for the first time, I think gaining mental clarity around my future, that really put me at peace. Like that, I was like, oh, okay. So I can see myself becoming a coach. This is before I niched in pain recovery because I actually still had chronic pain. I was like, I could see myself, I think it was like, I'll be a consultant or I'll be a coach because I had the chronic pain. I was like, I can't do this 9 to 5 gig forever. Like I need flexibility, right? When you have chronic pain, it's so hard to get through a 9 to 5 shift, right? Where you have to be at someone's every beck and call all day. And so that's actually what led me to look into being an entrepreneur. And so, yeah, heading down that path, gaining more confidence and gaining more hope about where I was headed professionally actually helped me. It helped reduce my stress quite a bit. I was chronically stressed, and it helped reduce a lot of my anxiety. And I think for some people, and I see this with some clients, like they are looking for purpose. And even clients that are older and maybe they don't want to start a career, they're looking for some purpose in their life in retirement. So I think purpose can be a really great healer.
Yeah, I'd also say that it's almost like purpose is trying to get out of that person, but they're blocking it. Yeah,
Hmm.
so it's been trying to come out, and because it's trying to come through them and align them to who they really are, it has no other way to give them the message but through pain or dysfunction.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that has been so great and so healing. Something else for me was just, I guess this is like feels more specific, was resetting my nervous system. Like, for years, I couldn't even take a deep breath. I was a shallow breather. And I learned transcendental meditation. There's a lot of meditations. And TM is an evidence-based approach for resetting your nervous system. So I was really curious about it. And when I first started doing it, I was having panic attacks. I mean, I literally could not sit still. And luckily, I was learning with a coach who was like, "Oh, your nervous system is very protective. So even though you're just sitting down and doing meditation, your brain is like, oh, what's happening?" So I had to go through that hump, but learning how to meditate, oh my God. I mean, it's simple, maybe not easy, but a simple technique was very life-changing for me. Just cultivating the art of stillness, being able to sit down for more than 10 minutes, being able to breathe, for so many years, I was just holding my breath. And a lot of people with chronic pain struggle with this, right? They struggle with doing the breath work. It can be triggering, or the meditation. But, really pushing myself to overcome some of those initial challenges was really worth it. So again, like regulating my nervous system is probably, if I could say the most important thing from my healing journey, it was regulating my nervous system. But again, I didn't have that awareness that my nervous system was dysregulated to begin with, because I was operating like that since the very beginning, basically.
Yeah, that's really awesome. But how did it look? So did you progressively get better weeks by weeks, months by months,
Great
or
question.
what did the actual recovery look like?
Well, when I started working with a life coach, I didn't work with a life coach for the sake of getting better from chronic pain. And so I was working with her for about a year. And
It's actually pretty, like, kind of useful in a way because you weren't trying to fix something.
exactly, yeah. And it honestly was a byproduct of doing life coaching, right? And working on my people pleasing and working on developing my life purpose. And I started to notice, I started to feel better. So it was very, very unexpected. And again, I wasn't thinking about it. I didn't get a chance to talk about this because I have so many pain issues, so little time. But I had developed hand pain that was like nerve related pain, where my hands just felt like they were on pins and needles and they were burning. I had no nerve issues, but the brain can generate that kind of pain, lead you to think that something's neurologically wrong. I played the guitar for many years growing up. And I remember I started to return to the guitar after 9 years. And, initially it was like it hurt a little bit, but through graded exposure, it became easier. And the next thing I know, I'm playing my guitar for 45 minutes, which I could not play the guitar for almost 10 years. So I started to notice, oh, I'm getting better. It was gradual in the beginning. For like the first couple of years, I would say I was semi recovered. And I actually was like, I was still on medications. So I knew I still had a way to go. And at that point, I was like, you know what? I'm doing well. I'm performing. I'm playing my guitar. I'm like going to the gym. I'm like wearing Van slip-ons again. I'm wearing high heels. It's like these little things, right? I can go to the movie theater. I can sit on an uncomfortable bar stool on a date. I felt normal. And then I got hit with a nasty flare up, with a nasty, nasty flare up. And it was a few months after I lost a loved one tragically. And I think I was so grief stricken that things came up for me. So anyway, I ended up in a lot of pain. And it was literally, I remember this like it was yesterday. I was in my bed and I'm like, I had read Alan Gordon's book, The Way Out. And so it was like in the back of my mind, and I thought about it and I was like, okay, I'm going to look into this. And so I Googled PRT, and then I had a conversation shortly thereafter with somebody. And then I started doing PRT, and it was PRT that took me to the finish line. So it was that combination of life coaching and PRT, which are the modalities that now inform my practice.
Yeah, that's awesome. Like, how do you feel now? We'd love to hear how you,
Well,
like, what's life like right now?
amazing. I mean, yeah, I feel like I'm having this rebirth. That's what it feels like over the past years, is just like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to feel like, to feel healthy in your body, And I feel very grateful as well, because I think able-bodiedness is a privilege, and not everyone gets to feel this way. Not everyone gets to feel comfortable and to, you know, just have a pain-free existence. And so I have a lot of gratitude. Like I said, I'm back in the gym, I'm working out I'm doing like high intensity cardio dance workouts that I could have never done before. I couldn't work out really at all, maybe besides the occasional walk for several years. I'm busier than before because before I could only take on so much in a day. I'm like, I need to ensure I have at least 4 hours to do nothing and to just rest and be in bed. I spent so many years being bedridden. You have no idea. And actually, I have a lot of energy. Like I there's a lot that I want to do in life. And so it's like I'm like catching up, and I feel like I'm making up for those lost times, but still doing it in a sustainable manner. But I feel like, starting my own business, that was something that, I can't even tell you how excited I was to be doing that. I never thought that I would do something. I never thought I would approach being an entrepreneur, because of the stress that I would associate with it, like years ago. Well, that'd be so stressful to like have, and there's stress with it. But I think overcoming a lot of those fears, and I had so many fears, overcoming those fears, I think it really has just toughened me up. And I think this is who I was meant to be. I think this was like, it was always in me all along, so it feels like, it's like I feel different, but at the same time, I feel like exactly who I'm supposed to be, if that makes sense. I feel like being authentic, being able to be myself is something that I've always longed for, and for so many years, I wasn't able to do that. And so being able to do that has brought me a lot of fulfillment.
Yeah. I'm so happy that you get to live life again.
Thank you. Yeah, it feels good to live life. And I always share this because I think it's interesting. My name, Yalda, means rebirth in Persian. It's like,
That's amazing.
that's fate. Okay.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fitting name,
Amazing. It was built into the storyline in advance.
right? Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm curious your thoughts on women's sexual beliefs and how that could influence pelvic floor issues in their body.
Yeah. Well, we live in a society where sexuality is deemed as a very taboo topic of discussion, just generally speaking. But our culture, and really most cultures, regard a woman's sexuality in particular as something shameful, as something to be concealed and never openly talked about. And so the reality is that women, and men have these deep rooted, internalized belief systems about their sexuality. So many women who experience pelvic pain either have a history of, sexual violence, such as sexual assault, but there are also women who don't have a history of any kind of sexual assault, whether in, childhood or adulthood, who experience pelvic pain. And that can be for different reasons, including having a negative sexual experience. And so that could look like there being consent. Let's say initially there is consent in having a sexual experience, whether it's intercourse or other forms of sex. And let's say that person ghosts you right afterwards. Or let's say that you find out that they were, sleeping with somebody else. Or you find out that they sleep with your best friend. And now there's this trauma, right? There's this, maybe not sexual trauma, but there's emotional trauma that surrounds this experience, this very intimate experience that you just had. And I think why that's so challenging for women is because we've been conditioned, to believe that, our body is so sacred, and it is, but there tends to be feelings of guilt and regret that one can experience when that relationship or that connection is suddenly over. And now you start to experience shame with your body, like, oh my God, I just gave this guy access to my body and he left me, And if you try to talk about it sometimes to get some things off of your chest, even your friends may say, well, you know what guys are like. They hit it and quit it, Don't let it bother you. It's just the way the world is. But you're left feeling like not good about yourself. And the reality is that you did nothing wrong, right? You just responded to what felt good in the moment, and you engaged in a sexual act. There was consent. Everything was fine. Now, obviously, afterwards, things didn't go as planned, right? Maybe the relationship didn't unfold in the situation that you would have liked to. So there's nothing to be ashamed of, but the reality is that those deeply ingrained belief systems about sexuality have a powerful influence on how you see yourself, right? And so I think dealing with that regret and that remorse can be really, really challenging for women in particular.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I've had a lot of clients, men and women, who have had adverse sexual situations that weren't assault, but afterwards they're like, I just felt icky about it. I felt dirty. I feel regret. It just wasn't a good situation. It was a bad choice I made. Oftentimes they'll have phantom STD like symptoms as well. So it'll be as if they're actually really scared, often like, wow, I got an STD or an STI. And they get it checked out and there's no bacteria, there's no viral infection. But the brain is creating it basically as a response to the emotional reaction that's being experienced around it. But like you said, culturally, societally, we have certain paradigms around sex, and that is something that is thrown onto men and women whenever they're just being born into the world right now. So the more that we talk about it and realize it's okay to just talk about these things, first of all. It's not even a problem to be able to experience sex and connection and everything like that. But realize that your brain could actually be creating the symptoms that are very real, but
Mhm.
it's no surprise why they're showing up in that region of the body too. Like there's a connection there. And so you are a mind body practitioner now. Tell us about what you do for work in that area. And of course, you're available to help people too.
Yeah, absolutely. So my coaching business is called Empowered Healing Coaching. And the little slogan is from disempowered to empowered, because I think living with chronic pain can be so disempowering. And I think, for so many years being told, well, we don't really know what's wrong. There's no cure. You can only manage your symptoms, to just all of these breakthroughs that have been made in pain science, and all of the education and awareness that we have now is so empowering, right? So I really love to utilize, that lens of empowerment in the work that I do. And it's really empowering clients to recognize that they do have the power within themselves to create the change that they seek, you know, it's just believing that is such an important first step. I have a monthly meetup group that's virtual and it's free. And I think this is a really great way for those who are maybe struggling with chronic pain to join a community of other people who are also experiencing similar issues. I feel like I could have really benefited from that because I felt really isolated. And I think it's natural to feel very alone when you're struggling. Oh, no one's going to understand me, or I have the weirdest pain issues. I'm such a freak. I mean, it's like we have these like terrible thoughts about ourselves, but actually, there's so millions of people who are struggling with chronic pain. I think it's like 1.8 billion people worldwide. And so just being in a space where you get to connect with people is so important for our healing, Being around people who can genuinely empathize is so important for our healing. And also in that monthly meetup group, I talk about myself, I talk about life coaching, I talk about pain reprocessing therapy. So there's a little bit of education that happens in that monthly meetup group as well. So I offer that, and I'm offering coaching as well. So I do one-on-one coaching and also group coaching.
Nice. That's amazing. Yeah, we'll definitely reach out to Yalda for any help that you may need. I also help men and women with pelvic floor issues. And thank you for this conversation. I mean, it was such an amazing thing to even go back to the beginning in childhood. A lot of people don't talk about that. Yet I also had mind body symptoms in my childhood. And it's
Mm.
kind of perplexing but when you see the similarities, the consistencies, there's the corollary from childhood all the way to adulthood. Like I can see where it started and how it stayed with me until I saw it for what it really was, saw it for a pattern that I identified with as myself. But it was really just something that was thrown on me by the environment or the traumas or the moments in time. We're human
Mhm.
beings, though. We're doing the best we can with all the things that we have with us. So thank you for the conversation, though. And we'd love to hear any comments below on how it helped you.
Thank you.